Picture yourself behind the wheel, driving the long stretch of I-10 between Lordsburg and Deming, New Mexico. Out here, the world shrinks to the glow of your headlights and the steady hum of the engine. The desert at night is empty, silent, and every mile feels like it belongs to you alone. It's just you, the moon, and the distant shapes of cacti and rocks slipping past the window. Then, out of nowhere, you catch sight of an abandoned car on the shoulder, hazards blinking, trunk open. Eerie shapes stalk your headlights, and the feeling settles in that something isn't right. When a voice finally crackles over your CB radio, it's not comfort you hear, but a warning. Don't stop. For one seasoned trucker, this wasn't just another lonely haul through the desert. It was the start of a night that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the road. Harold kept his hands steady on the wheel as the highway unfurled in front of him, the desert pressing in from both sides. He'd just passed mile marker 55 on I-10, hauling a trailer full of produce from Phoenix to El Paso. The night outside was the kind that could swallow a person whole, sand stretching out in every direction, the sky so wide and empty it felt like he was driving through the bottom of a dry ocean. It was the sort of landscape that made you notice every sound, every flicker of movement, and the way your own thoughts could grow louder than the engine. He'd done this run more times than he could count. The cab was familiar, the seat molded to his shape, the dashboard lights a soft glow against the dark. The hum of the AC and the radio's faint static were background noise, not distractions. Most nights, the routine was a comfort. Out here, nothing changed unless the weather turned or a coyote darted across the road. But tonight, something was off. He felt it before he could name it. A tension that made him sit a little straighter, scan the road a little more carefully. Up ahead, a thin, uneven glow broke the monotony. At first, Harold thought it might be another trucker pulled over for a quick break. But as he drew closer, the blinking hazard lights stood out against the black, their orange flashes strangely urgent. He flicked on his high beams, and the shape of a car came into focus, a 70s sedan, paint faded and doors shut tight. The trunk gaped open, empty, like it was waiting for someone to come back and finish something. He slowed down, letting his headlights sweep over the scene. No one stood by the car. The air felt sharper, as if the temperature had dropped a few degrees. He looked for any sign of movement, but the only thing out of place was a set of boot prints pressed into the fine desert sand, trailing away from the car and vanishing into the darkness. The prints didn't go toward the road or even along it. They led straight out, into the open land where the sand could swallow a person in minutes. Harold followed them with his eyes until they disappeared beyond the reach of his lights. Most people stranded out here would stick close to their vehicle. It was the only shelter for miles, and walking into the desert at night was a risk only the desperate would take. He couldn't see any sign of a note or a phone left on the seat, nothing to explain why someone would abandon both car and common sense. The thought left him uneasy. Maybe they'd gone looking for help, but out here, help was a long way off. He considered stopping, just for a moment, but his instincts told him to keep moving. He'd heard stories. Everyone had. Sometimes a car on the side of the road was just that. Other times it was bait. People faked breakdowns to lure in anyone willing to help, hoping to catch someone off guard. Harold wasn't new to the road. He knew how quickly things could go wrong when you let curiosity override caution. He glanced at his CB radio, half expecting to hear someone else mention the abandoned car. The channel was quiet, except for the occasional burst of static. He turned the dial, listening for any hint that another driver had seen what he saw. Nothing. Just the low hiss of empty airwaves. If anyone else had passed by, They hadn't bothered to say so. Harold let the truck roll past the sedan, his eyes lingering on the open trunk and the empty driver's seat. The boot prints were already fading in his mind, turning into another odd detail he'd try to forget by morning. He pressed the accelerator and let the road pull him forward, telling himself it was just another strange night in the desert. Minutes slipped by. The routine returned, but it didn't feel as solid as before. He kept replaying the scene in his mind. The way the trunk yawned open, the way the boot prints seemed to lead nowhere, the way the sand looked like it could erase any sign of someone's passing in a matter of hours. He tried to shake it off, focusing on the lines of the road and the steady thump of the tires. The desert was full of oddities, and most of them had simple explanations. Still, he couldn't quite let go of the feeling that he'd missed something important. He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the image from his mind. Before he could settle back in, another set of hazard lights appeared up ahead. This time the glow was brighter, closer, and Harold felt his stomach tighten. He slowed down, letting his headlights wash over the scene. Another 70s sedan parked at an angle on the opposite shoulder, trunk open and empty. It looked almost identical to the first, right down to the faded paint and the way it sat crooked on the edge of the pavement. Harold's breath caught. He scanned the area for any sign of movement, but the road was empty. No one stood by the car. No one waved for help. He checked the mirrors, half expecting to see someone step out from behind the trunk. Nothing. The boot prints from the first car came back to him, and he wondered if there would be more in the sand here too. Another set leading off into the night. Another person vanished into the desert. The odds of seeing two abandoned cars, both the same make and model, both with open trunks, on the same stretch of road, were slim. He tried to reason through it. Maybe the first car had been towed. Maybe he was seeing things. Maybe the desert was playing tricks on his mind. But the details were too sharp, too specific to ignore. He gripped the wheel tighter, feeling the skin of his knuckles stretch. The radio crackled again, a burst of static that sounded almost like a voice before fading out. He turned the volume down, trying to focus on the road. The second car felt like a warning, not just a coincidence. He kept his speed steady, resisting the urge to look back. The hazard lights blinked slower on this car, their rhythm almost hypnotic. Harold watched them fade in his mirrors, the red glow shrinking until it was just another point of light lost in the distance. He felt the tension in his shoulders, the way his mind kept circling back to the same questions. Who had left those cars? Where had they gone? And why did it feel like he was being watched? He drove on, the silence inside the cab growing heavier with each mile. The desert outside pressed closer, the darkness thicker than before. Harold tried to focus on the road, but the images stuck with him. The empty cars, the boot prints swallowed by sand, the sense that something out here was not right. He didn't know what to expect next, but he kept his eyes on the road, waiting for the next sign that the night wasn't done with him yet. The highway stretched ahead in a perfect line, nothing but darkness and the faint shimmer of heat still trapped in the asphalt. This highway is a flat, endless ribbon, exactly like the research describes, so any unexpected shape stands out. Harold watched the dashed white lines slip beneath him, mind still grinding over the details of the two abandoned cars. He tried to shake it off, focusing on the familiar routine of driving, eyes flicking between the road and the CB radio's steady glow. A shape appeared in his headlights. First it was just a shadow, then a figure, tall, unmistakably human, standing dead center in the lane. He felt his pulse jump. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, arms at its sides, head tipped forward as if waiting for something. The beam of his headlights carved out its outline, sharp and unnatural against the open stretch of I-10. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. Not at this hour. Not on this stretch of road. Harold's hands tightened on the wheel. He eased off the accelerator, but his mind was already racing ahead, running through every story he'd ever heard about roadside dangers. The figure's stillness was the first thing that made his skin crawl. It didn't wave, didn't gesture, didn't even seem to notice the 18-wheeler bearing down on it. Most people would have stepped aside, or at least shown some sign of needing help. This person, or whatever it was, stood fixed in place, as if rooted to the blacktop. He tapped the horn, a short, sharp warning. No response. He tried again, holding the horn longer this time, still nothing. The figure was close enough now for Harold to see how rigid it stood. Shoulders squared, arms straight, head bowed. The posture felt mechanical, almost rehearsed, and he caught himself thinking of mannequins in store windows, the way they always seemed just a little too lifelike when you walked past after closing time. He flicked his high beams off and on, hoping the sudden glare might startle a reaction. Nothing changed. The figure's face was still hidden in shadow, the features flat and unreadable. No hair moved in the breeze. No clothes caught the light. Just a dark, solid outline, more like a cutout than a living person. The monotony of the drive, the fatigue, and the emptiness of the desert all pressed in at once, making it hard to trust what he was seeing. Every instinct Harold had screamed at him to keep moving. He'd heard the warnings from other drivers about stopping for strangers, especially at night. The stories always ended the same way. Someone tried to help and never made it home. He gripped the wheel harder, jaw clenched as he weighed his options. He didn't want to stop. He didn't want to swerve either, not on a road this straight and open, where every move was obvious and there was nowhere to hide. The truck slowed almost on its own, his foot hovering over the pedals, but his mind was already set. He would not stop. If anything, he'd plow forward and hope the figure moved. The closer he got, the more he noticed about the way it stood. It wasn't just still, it was wrong. The body language didn't match anything he'd ever seen. It was too straight, too perfectly balanced, like someone had posed it for a photograph and then walked away. 15 yards. The headlights washed over the figure, but the details didn't sharpen. If anything, the edges seemed to blur, the way heat rises off the road on a summer afternoon. He blinked, tried to clear his vision, but the effect stayed. The darkness behind the figure swallowed everything, making it look even more out of place. He couldn't see any sign of a vehicle, no flashlight, no bag, nothing that would explain why someone would be out here alone. He tried the horn again, this time a long, steady blast. The sound echoed down the empty highway, but the figure didn't flinch. It just stood there, as if it hadn't heard a thing. Harold's mind raced through possibilities. Was it someone in trouble, someone playing a prank, or just his tired eyes misreading the shadows? He wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, but the fear settling in his chest felt too real. The figure finally moved. It turned with a mechanical slowness, every motion stiff and deliberate, like the joints were rusty or it was following a script. The movement was wrong, too smooth in some ways, too jerky in others. Harold felt a jolt of adrenaline, a cold spike that made his hands sweat. The research was right. The human brain is built to react to things like this, to scan for threats and prepare for the worst. His heart hammered in his chest, his body ready to bolt even as he sat locked in the cab. He caught a flicker of something, maybe a face, maybe just the play of shadows, before the figure finished turning. There was no sign of fear, no sign of life, just an absence, a blankness that made his skin crawl. He couldn't make sense of it, and that made it worse. The mind tries to fit things into patterns, to explain the unexplainable, but nothing about this made sense. Harold's instincts took over. He pressed down on the accelerator, the engine roaring as the truck surged forward. The figure didn't try to move out of the way, didn't even react as the headlights washed over it. For a split second, Harold thought he saw the shadows around its edges ripple, like heat distortion, but he didn't slow down to look. He kept his eyes straight ahead, knuckles white on the wheel. The truck passed the spot where the figure had stood. He didn't look in the mirrors. He didn't want to know if it was still there, or if it had vanished back into the darkness. The highway stretched out in front of him, empty again, but the sense of unease didn't fade. It settled in his gut, heavy and cold, as if the figure had left something behind. He tried to focus on the road, tried to tell himself it was over, but the feeling lingered. He glanced at the CB radio, half expecting it to stay silent like it had all night. Instead, a burst of static broke the quiet, louder than before. The sound made him jump, nerves stretched thin by everything he'd just seen. The static faded for a moment, then came back, sharper this time. He reached for the radio, hand shaking, not sure what he expected to hear. The desert outside was silent, the truck the only thing moving for miles. He waited, breath held, listening for anything that might make sense of what had just happened. Then, through the crackle, a voice cut in, distorted and faint, but clear enough to make out two words that matched exactly what his instincts were already screaming. "Don't stop." The radio's sudden intrusion lingered in the cab, the words still echoing in the air as if the static hadn't really faded. The CB had been just background noise all night, nothing but a faint hum and the occasional burst of static. But now every crackle seemed sharper, more pointed. Harold's mind kept circling back to that voice. Distorted, warped, the syllables stretched thin by the distance and the technology. It didn't sound like any trucker he'd ever heard. The warning was too brief, too urgent, and it cut through the silence in a way that made everything else seem less real. He kept one eye on the road and one on the radio, half expecting more. The desert outside pressed in close, black and empty except for the narrow band of light thrown by his headlights. He tried to convince himself it was just interference, maybe a stray broadcast bouncing off the mesas, but the timing was too precise. Moments after the figure vanished from the road, the warning came through. The connection was impossible to ignore. Harold's thumb hovered over the mic button, but he didn't press it. He didn't know what he would say if he did. The rules of the road were clear. Don't advertise your fear. Don't invite more trouble. Still, the urge to call out, to demand who was on the other end, gnawed at him. The CB's green display glowed steady, offering no clues, no sign of another rig nearby. The air inside the cab felt heavy, the stale scent of coffee and vinyl more noticeable now that his nerves were on edge. He tried to focus on the practical. Maybe the voice belonged to a driver further up the highway, someone who'd seen the same things and decided to warn anyone coming behind. It was possible. But the way the voice broke through, just those two words, nothing more, felt intentional. It didn't sound like a warning meant for the general airwaves. It felt personal, like someone was watching, waiting for him to pass by before speaking up. He checked his mirrors again, looking for headlights or a shadow of movement, but the road behind him was empty. Out here, the isolation was almost complete. The CB radio was supposed to be a lifeline, a way to stay connected even on the loneliest stretches, but now it felt like a crack in the armor, a line that anything or anyone could reach through. The silence after the message was worse than the message itself. It left too much room for his mind to wander, to imagine what could be lurking just beyond the reach of the headlights. Harold's thoughts drifted to every strange story he'd heard at truck stops. Voices on the radio that didn't belong, warnings that came too late. drivers who vanished without a trace. He'd always chalked those stories up to boredom and long hours, the kind of thing people invented to pass the time. But tonight, with the voice still fresh in his ears, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled into one of those stories himself. He adjusted the radio, turning the volume down, then up again, but the static stayed steady. The voice didn't return. He tried to reassure himself that it was over, that it was just a fluke, but the tension in his shoulders wouldn't ease. Every small sound inside the cab, the creak of the seat, the rattle of a loose thermos, seemed amplified. He found himself listening for another voice, another warning, but the only thing that came was the low, steady rush of static. The memory of the warning replayed in his mind, each repetition a little sharper, a little more insistent. Don't stop. The distortion made it hard to pin down any details, male or female, young or old, but the urgency was unmistakable. It wasn't a joke or a prank. It was a command, and it carried the weight of someone who'd seen what could happen if you didn't listen. Harold's hands tightened on the wheel, and he forced himself to keep his eyes on the road. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe the voice was meant for someone else. But the timing, the way it came right after the figure disappeared, made that hard to believe. He thought about stopping, pulling over to check the truck or just to catch his breath. But the warning echoed in his head, pushing him forward. The miles ticked by, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. The CB radio, once a comfort, now felt like a threat. He kept glancing at it, half expecting another message, but it stayed quiet. The silence pressed in, thick and unbroken, except for the soft hum of the tires on the pavement and the faint, ever-present static. He tried to shake off the feeling, to remind himself that he was alone out here, that there was no one else for miles. But the desert had a way of making you doubt what you knew. The emptiness could play tricks on your mind, turning shadows into threats and silence into something sinister. He focused on the road, on the lines that stretched endlessly ahead, but his mind kept drifting back to the voice. He wondered who or what had sent the warning. Was it a fellow driver trying to help, or something else entirely? The lack of explanation gnawed at him. He wanted to believe in the ordinary, in the idea that every mystery had a simple answer, but tonight the ordinary felt far away. The warning had changed something. The drive no longer felt routine. Every mile brought new tension. Every shadow seemed to move just out of sight. Harold's world had shrunk to the cab, the headlights, and the radio that refused to offer any comfort. He found himself scanning the edges of the road, looking for signs of movement, for anything that might explain what was happening. The desert outside was as empty as ever, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. He tried to remember the rules he'd learned over years on the road. Trust your instincts, keep moving, don't let fear take over. But the rules felt thin tonight, stretched by the weight of what he'd seen and heard. The voice on the CB had pierced the bubble of isolation that usually protected him, leaving him exposed to whatever else might be out there. The radio stayed silent, but Harold couldn't shake the sense that the warning wasn't finished. The road ahead looked the same as always, straight, endless, unbroken. But now it felt different. He kept his speed steady, resisting the urge to push the truck faster, but every nerve in his body was on alert. The warning replayed in his mind, a constant reminder that something had shifted out here in the dark. As he drove, the cab felt smaller, the darkness outside more complete. He checked his mirrors again, searching for headlights, for movement, for any sign that he wasn't alone. The CB radio glowed quietly, its silence as unsettling as any message. The warning lingered, shaping every thought, every decision, as the miles slipped by. A flicker of movement in the side mirror caught his eye. Just a shadow, quick and faint, but enough to make his pulse jump. He looked again, heart pounding, but the road behind him was empty. Still, the sense of being followed was impossible to ignore. The static on the radio rose and fell, each swell a reminder of the warning he couldn't forget. He tried to focus on the lines of the road, on the rhythm of the drive, but the feeling of being watched clung to him. The desert outside was silent, but inside the cab the tension kept building. The radio might have gone quiet, but the message was still there, urging him forward, making him question every shadow and every sound. The miles ahead stretched out, unbroken and uncertain, and Harold's grip on the wheel tightened as he tried to convince himself that he was still alone out here. But the feeling wouldn't leave. Something was out there, and he couldn't shake the sense that it was moving closer, keeping pace with every mile he drove. Harold's grip on the wheel stayed tight. He forced his eyes back to the highway, but every muscle in his body stayed keyed up, waiting for something else to go wrong. The CB's static faded to the background. He kept glancing at the mirrors, not sure what he expected to see, but unable to stop himself from checking. The warning, "Don't stop," felt heavier now, as if it had weight. He tried to focus on the road, counting the faded white lines, but his attention kept drifting to the edges of his vision. A flicker of movement caught his eye in the side mirror. At first he thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow maybe, or dust kicked up from the shoulder. But then the shape sharpened. He saw it clearly, a figure running alongside the truck, just outside the reach of the headlights. The man's legs moved fast, too fast to be possible, matching the truck's speed without effort. Harold's mind told him this couldn't be real. No one could run like that. Not out here. Not at this speed. He tried to look away, tried to convince himself it was a mirage, but the figure didn't fade. It kept pace, a dark outline against the desert. He could just make out the face turned toward him, eyes wide and staring, mouth open as if gasping for air. For a second, Harold thought he saw the man's lips move, whispering something he couldn't hear. The word was lost in the noise of the engine and the wind, but it looked like a plea. Help. A cold sweat broke out across Harold's neck. He snapped his gaze forward, heart pounding, and pressed harder on the accelerator. The truck's engine strained, the speedometer needle edging higher. But when he checked the mirror again, the figure was still there. It didn't fall behind. It didn't slow down. It just kept running, eyes fixed on Harold through the glass. He blinked, squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, then looked again. The figure was gone. The highway behind him was empty, just darkness and the faint glow of the taillights on the asphalt. He let out a shaky breath and tried to reason through it. Maybe it was exhaustion, a trick of the mind after too many hours behind the wheel. He'd heard stories from other drivers, phantom shapes, faces in the dark, things that vanished as soon as you looked straight at them. He wanted to believe that's all it was. But then, in the next mirror, the figure reappeared. Still running, still impossibly fast, still staring at him with that same desperate, terrified expression. The face was clearer this time, the eyes wide, the mouth moving. Harold thought he saw the word again. Help, though he still couldn't hear it. The man's features twisted in fear, not anger, as if he was running from something even worse just out of sight. Harold's chest tightened. He couldn't look away, couldn't stop checking the mirrors even though every instinct told him not to. The figure's arms pumped at its sides, the movement oddly smooth and relentless. It was like watching a machine, not a person. The desert outside the cab was silent, but inside, the sound of his own breathing filled the space, ragged and quick. He forced himself to focus on the road, but the rhythm of the drive was gone. Every time he looked, the figure was there, sometimes closer, sometimes further, but never gone for long. The landscape around him felt different now, less familiar, more hostile. The desert was no longer empty. It pressed in on him, the darkness heavier and more complete. The CB radio crackled again, the sound sharp in the quiet. Harold jumped, hand twitching toward the dial, but the voice didn't return. Just static, rising and falling, filling the cab with a restless energy. He tried to convince himself it was just interference, maybe another trucker somewhere out of sight, but the timing was too perfect. Every time the figure appeared, the radio came to life. Every time it vanished, the static faded. He thought about stopping, about pulling over and getting out, but the warning echoed in his mind, "Don't stop." The voice on the radio had been clear. He kept his foot on the gas, pushing the truck faster, the engine's growl filling the cab. He checked the mirrors again. The figure was still running, face twisted in fear, mouth forming words Harold couldn't hear. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, brought on by long hours and too much caffeine. Maybe he was seeing things that weren't there. But the fear felt real. The figure's eyes were too clear, the movement too precise. It wasn't just a shadow or a reflection. It was something else, something that didn't belong on this stretch of highway. The road ahead seemed to stretch further than before, the lines on the pavement blurring together. Harold blinked hard, trying to clear his vision, but the feeling didn't go away. The desert looked different, the familiar landmarks gone, replaced by an endless, empty expanse. The sense of being followed grew stronger, pressing in from all sides. He gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white, and tried to focus on the task at hand. Keep driving. Don't stop. Trust your instincts. He'd heard that advice 100 times from other drivers, but it had never felt so urgent. The rules of the road were simple, but tonight nothing felt simple. The figure in the mirror, the voice on the radio, the endless stretch of highway, they all blurred together, turning the routine of the drive into something strange and threatening. The figure flickered one last time in the side mirror, eyes wide, mouth moving in a soundless whisper. Harold looked away, forcing himself to stare straight ahead. The road kept going, the asphalt stretching out into the darkness, the familiar world falling away behind him. He didn't know how long he'd been driving when he realized the road ahead didn't look right. The landmarks were gone. The desert had changed. Harold's hands stayed tight on the wheel, his body braced against the seat as though something unseen might jolt him at any moment. The highway stretched out ahead, and I watched the lines slide under my headlights, the desert pressing in on both sides. This run between Lordsburg and Deming was supposed to be routine, but nothing about the night felt familiar anymore. I kept searching for something I recognized, a sign, a rock formation, even the faint glow from a distant gas station. But the world outside the windshield stayed blank. The road just kept going, flat and featureless, as if it had been wiped clean. I glanced at the GPS again, hoping for reassurance. The map showed the same route I'd always taken, the blue line tracking my progress along I-10. But the screen felt useless. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd slipped off the map, that the coordinates meant nothing out here. My sense of time stretched thin. I'd lost track of how many miles had passed, how long I'd been driving through the dark. The clock on the dash ticked forward, but it didn't match the way the night dragged on. The silence in the cab weighed on me. I fiddled with the CB radio out of habit, twisting the dial, listening for the familiar voices of other drivers. Nothing but static. No chatter about road conditions, no jokes, no warnings. Just the memory of that voice, "Don't stop," echoing in my head. It was strange how much comfort I usually took from the background noise, the sense that there were other people out there moving through the same night. But now, I might as well have been the last person left on the road. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe the darkness was playing tricks. Maybe I'd missed a landmark or two because I was tired, because the moonlight wasn't strong enough to pick out the shapes I knew. I'd heard stories from other truckers about long nights and empty highways, how sometimes the world could seem to fold in on itself, how the mind could get lost in the repetition. But it wasn't just the emptiness that got to me. It was the sense that the road itself was holding me in place, refusing to let me leave. Every so often I checked my mirrors, half expecting to catch a glimpse of that figure again, or maybe the outline of an abandoned car sitting on the shoulder. The glass showed only darkness. I thought about pulling over, just to stop and breathe, but the warning wouldn't let me. I kept my hands on the wheel and my foot steady on the gas. The air inside the cab felt stale, heavy with the smell of old coffee and diesel. I rolled my shoulders, trying to work out the tension, but it wouldn't leave. There was a heaviness in the air, the kind that settles in when something's wrong and you can't put your finger on it. I remembered hearing other drivers talk about it, how the familiar could turn on you in an instant, how a stretch of road you'd driven 100 times could suddenly feel like a trap. I found myself watching the edges of the highway, waiting for something to break the pattern, a coyote darting across the pavement, a signpost with a familiar name, even the reflection of my own headlights in a road sign. Nothing. The world outside the cab stayed stubbornly blank, the desert swallowing up any sign of life. I tried to distract myself by counting the lines on the road, but I lost track almost immediately. As the night dragged on, the sense of unease only grew. My thoughts circled back to the figure I'd seen, the voice on the CB, the way the world seemed to have shifted just out of reach. I gripped the wheel tighter, telling myself to focus on the simple things. Keep the truck straight, watch the speed, don't let my mind wander too far. But the routine didn't help. The road kept stretching on, no end in sight. Eventually, the sky started to lighten, just a faint gray at first, then a pale wash of color spreading over the horizon. I watched the darkness retreat, expecting the world to snap back to normal as soon as the sun rose. That was how it usually worked. The strange things belonged to the night, and daylight always brought relief. I looked for the first signs of Deming, a billboard, the outline of buildings, maybe the lights of a truck stop, but the landscape stayed empty. When I finally reached the outskirts of town, the world looked the way it always had. The gas stations and rest areas stood where they were supposed to be. The road signs matched the map. I eased the truck into the parking lot of a rest stop, letting the engine idle while I tried to make sense of what had happened. The sun was up now, washing the desert in pale gold. Everything looked ordinary. I stepped out of the cab, stretching my legs, and walked a slow circle around the truck. There were no marks on the paint, no sign that anything had followed me or tried to get inside. I scanned the lot and the highway for abandoned cars, but there was nothing. No sign of the sedans I'd passed, no boot prints in the dust, no figure standing by the roadside. It was as if the night had erased itself. I went inside the rest stop and poured a cup of coffee, standing by the window and watching the traffic roll past. Other drivers came and went, talking about the weather, the price of fuel, the usual complaints. No one mentioned anything strange. I listened for a while, waiting for someone to bring up the cars or the figure, but the conversation stayed normal. After a while, I went back to the truck and checked the CB. The static was gone. I picked up the mic, thought about calling out, but I didn't have anything to say. The warning still echoed in my mind, but now it felt distant, like something I'd dreamed. I scanned the sky, the road, the empty desert stretching out in every direction. Everything looked the way it should. The sense of being trapped had faded, replaced by a kind of numbness. By the time I pulled back onto the highway, the sun was high and the world felt ordinary again. I kept looking for signs that something had changed, but there was nothing. No wrecks, no police tape, no sign that anything out of the ordinary had happened on this stretch of I-10. It was as if the night had never happened at all. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The routine had been broken, and I didn't know if it would ever feel quite the same. The road behind me was empty, but the memory of that endless night stayed close, just out of sight. Some things don't leave marks you can see. I kept driving, the highway unspooling ahead, but I knew I'd never look at this stretch of desert the same way again. After sunrise, I stopped in Deming and told the authorities everything I'd seen. They listened, asked a few questions, then sent a patrol back down I-10. They found nothing. No abandoned sedans, no footprints, no sign that anyone had stood in the road or run beside a truck that night. Nobody else reported anything strange. For them, it was just another quiet stretch of highway. But for me, the questions stayed. The voice on the radio, the silent figure, the cars, none of it made sense. Some mysteries don't get solved, and maybe that's for the best. Would you have stopped? Let me know what you'd do if you saw something like that on an empty highway.